In this episode, we dive deep into the world of multilingual AI and AI for translation. Can these models be prompted and respond in non-English languages yet? I've tried. It's difficult to understand. Can these models be used to translate, and in what circumstances is that better than other methods of translation? Should we be using LLMs for translation? What might fully fledged multilingual enable for startups, given that the company of the future is default global? Today, we have three of us here. Myself, Alex Den, Alex Papadopoulos-Korviatis, who is Senior Machine Learning Research Scientist with extensive knowledge in transcription, actually, which I think is very helpful here. And a long overdue return for Rafie Farouk, AI startup founder, who is looking very happy on the camera, who can speak to the Andreessen Horowitz view that the company of the future is default global and has, in his own words, decided to bring the banter today. Welcome both.
I see five Rafies on your screen, Rafie. I'm not sure who the real one is and who the AI generated ones are.
Yeah, so for context, my background generated by Midjourney, the prompt was a guy called Rafie Farouk, who's just an honest dude trying to make a living. So if you're watching on video, you can see the honest trying to make a living version of me, which is the actual me.
Nice caveat, nice recovery there.
Which is actually more than me than the actual me. I don't know where I'm going with this.
Alex looks like he is about to get surprised, attacked from behind by this robot that seems to be levitating the world.
It's supposedly a translator AI. It does have like some pretty old school looking headphones. And at least there's a globe there showing that there's multiple languages. But yeah, it is a bit menacing behind me. What about you, Alex? That's a lot of flags that you have on your background there.
The flags are close to real flags, but there are definitely some made up ones as well. Yeah, there's sort of tens of thousands of flags floating above what seems to be the world's largest market square for eating and communicating. The prompt was about, being able to just have conversations and AI facilitating conversations between different languages in perfect harmony. It has festival tents as well. Is this the world's largest multilingual festival in the background? I think it might be.
I really want to be there. It looks really fun.
I love it. All right, on to the topic. Can models be used to translate? What circumstances should we use it? Where do we start with this? Because the data that really surprised me when I was doing research for this episode was the fact that Meta's Llama 2 model, which we spoke about recently, the training data was 90% English, 8% code, and 2% was left for 22 other languages. Surely that's not enough to do translation tasks. I don't know where to start. Like, are there tools that are trained with more multi-language data, non-English data? Does that even matter? Can the LLMs just figure it out from a really small portion of a language?
It's interesting because it seems that, so for example, the OpenAI, the GPT training data also heavily favor English, right? I think it was like 96% English or something like that. No, sorry, 92% English, and then like 1.8% French, 1.4% German, 0.8% Italian, and then it goes down. So there's still a massive English bias. But it seems that some large enough models kind of bleed through performance from English to other languages as well. So just because it's very good at English tasks, even a small amount of multilingual data is enough to make it better at that language than if it was just trained on that data as well. So you don't need necessarily equivalent amounts of data. You do though need data, right? So obviously if there's very, very few training data of a specific language, it's not going to do very well in that language. Maybe let's backtrack first a bit though and talk about machine translation. I did, I'm sorry. So machine translation, all of us have used Google Translate, for example, right? And this is a very good example of a classical machine learning, machine translation model. So you take a lot of parallel data You have a lot of English data, a lot of Greek data. I'm Greek, so I'll use the example of Greek. And then you just train a machine learning model that can translate between the two. And then depending on your training data, you have supported languages, right? So there's open source models. There's Marian NMT, for example. I think that's a pretty famous one. There's a lot of closed source services that do this. Google Translate is one. Microsoft has one. But also, I think another very popular one is DeepL that I've seen mentioned a lot. I think supposedly it's like excellent for longer document translation and also in Asian languages like Korean, Japanese, Chinese, etc. But yeah, on the other hand, there's like the new cool technology, which is large language models, generalist models that are kind of taking over all NLP tasks and just replacing them with one single model that can do everything, right? So the question is, can those models also do machine translation? Well, they can, obviously, but are they any good? Are they better or worse compared to the more classical machine translation approaches? So Alex, you've done a bit of research on this, right?
Yeah, I found a great piece of research on this actually. It's a company called Welocalize. They take websites and they localize them, shockingly, according to the name. And they have this great post on whether LLMs or machine translation, is that what MT engine stands for? Machine translation engines perform translation better. And they've got this fantastic table, which I'll put a link to the article in the show notes. And they have Google AutoML seems to perform the best. And that's where Welocalize claim that they've put their model into Google's AutoML and sort of done some fine tuning, if you like. It's their own version of AutoML, which I guess is a cloud-based Google translation service, compared to just basic Google Translates. They're showing that it's already better than Google Translate, what they do. But then they show how well OpenAI, GPT 3.5, GPT-4 performs. But also they do this interesting thing where they take machine translated, so through Google Translate, and then they'll put it into a GPT 3.5 or a GPT-4 to see how that performs. So even combining these technologies, which is often what happens, right, when we're in a bit of a Cambrian explosion of new use cases, new tools, you do want to see if you can sort of daisy chain them to get a better result than either one could perform on their own. It doesn't look like, broadly speaking, for Arabic, Latin, American Spanish, Japanese, Brazilian Portuguese, simplified Chinese, it doesn't look like for those standards, for those languages, for those benchmarks, LLMs do better than machine translation yet.
That's interesting. Yeah, not sure that fully tallies with my research, but I could be wrong as well. By the way, were we supposed to say hi in the beginning as well?
It's never too late to say hi.
Yeah, I'm just throwing out my hi, guys, just because, it's been like 3 or 4 months since I've been on the podcast, so I'm still loving the moment and milking it for all it's worth.
Milking it so much that there's not only you, but 4 other headshots behind you. You just really wanted to be present fivefold.
Exactly. And I might say hi at several points throughout the podcast just to reiterate the fact that I'm here again. But yeah, to your point, Alex. Yeah, this could be an interesting debate actually, because I did some research on which machine learning conferences are sort of the premier conferences in machine translation. And I think there's one called WMT. The website is machinetranslate.org. And there they have some shared tasks where different models are tested against different translation tasks. And the tasks included, for example, simply English to German translation, English to Chinese, and English to Japanese. And the best performing models was GPT-4 5-shot in pretty much all the cases. Czech to Ukrainian was this model called Online B. Don't really know what that is. And then there are some other models there as well. But yeah, GPT seemed to perform the best there, actually.
Would you mind just defining GPT-4 5-shot for me, please?
Yeah, actually, I was wondering the same. So the shots normally means how many goes you take at test time. So what I think they've done is they've taken 5 shots and probably averaged or picked the best one, something like that. But I haven't looked into it deeply.
One of the problems with comparing the machine translation models to GPT-4, for example, for translation, is that with GPT, you don't just have GPT as the model, but also the prompt that you're using in order to do the translation itself, right? So that's a pretty big variable, and changing the prompt could completely change the performance of the system. So what we really should be comparing is GPT plus prompt plus method, I guess, versus the traditional machine translation pipelines. I do agree with Rafie that my research as well is showing that at least for the most popular languages, the most high resource languages, let's say, GPT-4 is better than Google Translate and DeepL, for example. Where it suffers a lot is for the lower resource languages, where parallel data still gives you more information to go off than generalist language models. So for anything that we don't have enough data for, and that's a lot of languages, by the way, that we don't have enough data for, then you're still better off with classical machine translation models.
By the way, Alex D, did we ever come up with different names for you guys, by the way? Or was it just Alex D and Alex P?
I think Alex D and Alex P. I figure people know the difference between us now.
Okay, cool. Because I
When
know
when I was in school, I was in school in Belgium, so we had a Greek class, but our teacher was not Greek. So there was another Alex with his surname starting from Papa as well. So we had like 4 common letters. So that was even harder. I was Alex Papado, and he was Alex Papapo. So at least Alex Den and Alex Pap is easier. It's more well defined.
In a previous company, I worked with a chap called Alex Davies. Actually, I realized this is 2 other things. And then the CEO of the previous company I worked for was called Alex Dean, and I'm Alex Den. And a lot of people mistranslate my name as Dean. So what I did for when I started work with the Alex Davies, and we started the same week, so 2 Alex D's started in the marketing team at the same time, was I slept on it. I thought about it, and I thought it's just going to be so frustrating if people confuse us. So I was AJ at that company, and then when I joined the next one, I sort of had to keep AJ, even though I hate it. And my
Why
wife
J?
absolutely
Is that like
hates
your middle
it.
name or something?
Middle name, yeah, exactly. So there is that as an option, but only in dire circumstances, please.
I thought there was also Negroni Alex. What was the story behind that one?
It was Bacon Alex and non-Bacon Alex.
Oh yeah, true.
Yeah.
Were you the bacon Alex or the non-bacon Alex?
Yeah, I'm both Negroni and Bacon Alex. I have a more balanced diet than that, but I do like both of those things.
I was gonna say, not sure how related it was to the previous thread, but I know Bacon Alex, you were talking about generating or focusing on left to right languages for our work, because that might be a subset. So, languages that write from left to right, as opposed to, say, Hindi or Bengali, which is right to left. As it happens, I just thought I'd test that in GPT-4, and I asked it to write, "I love you and I would love you more if you had an AI model that was multilingual in 50 plus languages in Sanskrit," which I believe is right to left. And also you would think there's not too much training data on. It did produce the output in left to right, but I think it looks correct, but I have no way of verifying if it is correct or not. So that's interesting.
I think it needs to produce the output in left to right, just because that's how it's programmed. That's how the decoder is built. It cannot actually produce the other way, right? But it's interesting if it produces the right text, though. You'd imagine, though, that because when training, it also looks left to right, that it will get confusing information, right? Because it will be like trying to break causality in text in a way.
As part of my research for this, I learned that there are actually quite a few languages that historically, especially Eastern countries, had written from right to left, but then Western influence has meant that it's quite common for it to be written left to right. So even when I was researching, is Sanskrit left to right, or Devangari is coming up as another way to say that. is sometimes written from left to right and is sometimes written or read right to left. And anyway, obviously this is a bad example because we haven't done the research into it, but the number of languages, there's also different ways, right? Like there are some languages that are written in columns rather than in words that run from left to right. I suppose bring this back to as a point Alex made a second ago, where so Google Translate I think is really helpful for communication, but in our domain, which is the legal domain, you have documents that reference important things in a certain jurisdiction. If I was to put in a British employment contract and just Google Translate it to French, that would be garbage. Right, no French lawyer is going to use that. No French business is going to use that. If, however, I create a sequence of prompts that generate that, and those prompts are French, and I'm referencing France the entire time, I'm almost certain that the outcome of that will be tenfold more useful than translating an English contract. Not only because of the English jurisdiction, but because of, I just feel like all of those prompts, the chain of prompting, the whole way it works, it just provides a context for the AI to say, okay, I'm in France, I'm thinking in French, I need to go out and get this. But then I just worry that if such a thin slice of the training data is in French, then surely only a thin slice of the training data is France itself, unless it just sponges everything up about France that's in English and then can somehow do the translation leap. And it still has all the context it needs from that 2% or slice of the 2%. So the question is, do you think it makes sense when you want an output in another language to first generate the prompt in that language? And I think it does. I think it's, even if you can't say it has correctly created this prompt in French, I do think the output will be better than if you, and more reliably French, than if you prompted it in English and said, oh, by the way, and can you output it in French?
It seems like a great thing to test out. I don't know. It's hard to say which one would be better.
I think you are right, Bacon Alex. I'm just going to go with that now. I like the Grony Alex better. I'm going to go with that instead until you tell me off. But yeah, I did some research and some reading, and whilst I don't have a specific source, from what I recall, multilingual utterances, as they call it, is one of the key areas where GPT-4 performs badly in translation, and LLMs in general. So if you either ask it to generate a language in a different prompt, does less well at that, although still pretty good overall. But the bit where it really struggles is if you try to generate two languages in one utterance. That's currently an issue. But also,
by the way, Alex, sorry, go ahead, Rafie.
No, sorry, just I mean, how often do you really want to do that anyway? I'm not sure it's a common need.
Yeah,
but
that's a good point. Earlier, Alex, you raised a great point, I think, and in my mind, one of the great advantages of large language models as machine translators instead of the more classical models and its context. With the previous models, you cannot really give them context. They do tend to do literal translation more often than not. But with GPT and other large language models, you can give them context. So you could give them, even if you don't take your approach of generating prompts in French and then doing the generation using those prompts, you could give it a document in English or a website or whatever and ask it to localize that in French. But by giving it additional context about what the document is or what to make sure to do when translating this document, I think you can get a much better translation result compared to Google Translate, for example, or even DeepL that is quite good at translating whole documents. Just because context matters, right? And the language models enable you to inject that context, which is just not an option with the previous machine translation models.
Well, what I love about this is that not only does it allow you to inject the context, if you have it and you know it's unbiased, but you can allow it to collect it from the right place as part of a chain of prompt. So if let's say we had 2 pages on our site, just to keep it simple, one for an employment agreement that's for England and one for an employment agreement that's for France in French. If I take the employment agreement page and translate it, even though it will score well on these benchmarks of machine translation through Google Translate, because technically the words have been accurately translated, we know that that actually means nothing in the real world, because all I've done is I've localized content to a place where it's irrelevant. The way they talk about employment is different. All the laws are different. Even though the words might be correctly translated, the whole page is ultimately wrong. And so I think what we'll see, and I agree that LLMs are superior because of this one thing really, is we're going to see the death of localization and a new era, I suppose, of multilingual sites and companies where you generate locally. And as long as you create the right sequence of events to gather the context to then generate what's locally relevant in the right language, you create a page that is hyper relevant and in the user's natural language rather than something that feels a little bit clunky. Because we've all experienced that. You know, if you land on a page for whatever reason, last year I bought some seeds, some thornless blackberry seeds from a Ukrainian seed website, and I translated it, and there were just these funny little things that, you know, obviously just weren't translated right. I knew what it meant, but it was just odd. Like, think about how you manually would translate words like sign up and log in. You could do it in a way that literally makes sense, but if that's not how it's done in that country, if that's not exactly the word that everyone sees because it's on 99% of websites, Google Translate could get that wrong. But an LLM would probably get it right. Or maybe there'd be other examples that work better, but I think that's a fun one.
So what you're saying essentially, Alex, is that we go a level of abstraction up, and instead of working on the document level and then translate the document, work on the intention level and translate the intention and then generate documents from that translated intention, which is pretty cool.
Exactly that. Yeah. And I think I don't know if this is a good point to move on to the sort of practical applications. We are talking quite practically now. I think we would rather use LLMs rather than machine translation. I think we may use machine translation when we make our product multilingual in some ways. We will probably just have simple like find and replace for this is big table of words, and whenever you see these words or these phrases in the product and the person is coming from this country, use this word instead because that's their language. I imagine that's how Firefox went into more languages than Internet Explorer and Chrome in the early days of those browsers. So LLMs rather than machine translation engines, I think we prefer. But there's also some considerations. I imagine it's more expensive. I know there's an effect on token usage as well. If you were to say produce Greek content rather than English, is that right?
Correct. Yeah. So the tokenization is less efficient in languages that don't use Roman alphabet. So, for example, when I'm asking GPT to produce documents in Greek, the documents that it can produce are shorter than the equivalent English documents in number of characters. It's probably equivalent in number of tokens, but it's less. It's more tokens per character in Greek, let's say.
And is it fair to say that we don't know why? Is that one of the mysteries of LLMs?
I don't think so. No, we do know why. So that process of tokenization happens before the language model training. So we do understand why, and it's just because of the Unicode encoding of Greek characters, for example, and the fact that that is not true though. There is no more Greek characters than Roman alphabet characters. But I don't think that one is a mystery. We do understand why the tokenization is less efficient.
I just want to go back a bit to the translation of, say, a French legal document to English or vice versa. I think we can characterize this a bit differently. I think we could say that there's generalist translation of general language to another language, and then there's domain-specific translation. And in domain-specific translation, such as legal, as you rightly said, Alex, you can't just do word for word because you're translating the word, not the meaning, and the meaning needs to be translated. So we need different solutions for domain-specific translation. But what would be very interesting is to try still using LLMs as they are, but just change the prompt. So could you say, hey, translate this English language legal document to a French one, but don't translate word for word, use French-specific terminology, laws, and context, and then would that work, basically?
So from the testing that I've done on that exact thing, it doesn't seem to work as well. And I think the reason is that, and maybe this will change with the likes of GPT-5, but we know that the more sort of strategic steps or strategic sort of thinking points you give the model in the prompt, the less successful it will be at carrying out all of them. So if you if you can provide it with the context, if you can tell it to do the least amount of thinking possible, you will get the best response. So I think high quality localized prompt will generate the best output for, say, a French legal document. So I would imagine it should be a French prompt. You probably need to do a prompt beforehand to suggest all of the, regulations and things that document would need to cover. Various other things that go into generating a legal document, which is our example here. And if you instead gave it a long document and asked it to do that for you in one shot, or even 5 shot and then pick the best, I just don't think it would be as good as what's it called when you sequence, or like if you it's not parallelizing or serial. Say again. Sorry.
Maybe a pipeline, I would say, prompts, for example.
Yeah, so I think a pipeline definitely works best, where each part of the pipe you're closer to answering the overall strategic goal, but none of those parts of the pipe have more than one thing that you're asking the model at that time.
Yeah, makes sense. I guess for the purposes of this podcast, all of those problems will go away in time with better models, better compute power, bigger models. So you probably you don't need a different solution. We just need to wait long enough for the models to get good enough.
Yeah, and we'll enter a world where it's very easy, although it's probably quite easy for us to do this now. We could probably take the recording of this, take the transcription of this, translate it, and then put out an episode that is the exact episode with our voices in other languages as spoken by, say, 11 labs. And this podcast could go out in 100 different languages every week, even though we don't speak them. That's weird. I don't know. I think it's amazing. Yeah, I think it's definitely amazing. It's weird, but it's also amazing. I mean, it's incredible. It comes back to the default global point.
Maybe that should be an experiment for us to do, Alex. I think that's already doable, right? Maybe one of our next episodes, we should try to translate it to a few languages and generate text in those languages and see what that sounds like.
And
that's it. Going back to Rafie's point about just waiting for a larger model, I don't fully agree, because there's a lot of things that are not just solved by a larger model. And imagine, forget about models, imagine that you have a human translator and you give them a document to translate. In some cases, they'll have questions, right? And they'll need to understand, for example, your intention in why you want to translate this document and who this document is for in order to translate it correctly. So that's the same thing that we need to do with the models currently. And it's probably going to still be relevant in the future with better models. We still need to give appropriate context for the model to do a good job at translating or whatever task we ask them to do.
Yeah, I think it depends on the task. If the context is not embedded either within the document or within the entire body of known human knowledge that can be ingested, then yes, we need to give it more context, i.e., if you have a personal intention that can be found nowhere else, then yes, that needs to be given to the model.
Agreed, though what maybe will be skipped in the future is the interim steps of us making the model think through things and do their research. Because if you give a translation to a human, they'll probably go away and do a bit of research on the topic before translating, right? And currently with the models that we have, we need to handhold them through this process. So GPT-5 and above might skip this step of hand-holding and be able to do that research themselves.
So just summarizing, we've spoken a lot about GPT-4 Google Translate. I imagine Gemini will be brilliant at translating simply because of the fact that it has access to the Google ecosystem. Ones we haven't mentioned but have mentioned in previous episodes, is it worth just giving a mention to Mistral and BLOOM? Maybe Meta Llama in terms of what they're doing in this area. I don't know if either of you want to take one of those and just summarize it for someone who's thinking about picking up a project like this and listening.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So yeah, Mistral AI seem pretty cool. They have this idea of mixture of experts. They can do 32K tokens and handle the European languages pretty well. And I think they beat GPT 3.5 on various benchmarks. So they're decent, and it's open source as well. The issue really is between closed source and open source, because most open source models don't do as well as some of the major closed source providers at translation. So you've got Mistral AI, but the one I really liked was BLOOM. It is massive. It's 176 billion parameters. compared to many models that do just as well at around 30 to 40 billion parameters. But I like it because it was a cross collaboration between many researchers in many different countries, and the French government even invested and sponsored it. And it can produce outputs with coherent text in 46 languages and 13 programming languages that is apparently hardly distinguishable from text written by humans.
The fact that its selling point is coherent language and hardly distinguishable, it doesn't actually fill me with confidence. It's very cleverly worded to say it kind of does translation.
That's it. Like we discussed, Rafie, in one of the previous episodes, we discussed both Mistral and BLOOM. And like we discussed, BLOOM is a bit of a dated model, right? So at that point in time, it was important for the text to be, it was a development for the text to be fully coherent, right? Maybe now we take it for granted with GPT, but it was not something that all models had at that point. But yeah, I agree. I really like the BLOOM model as well. And with Mistral, there's a model that they have, I think Mistral Medium or something, that is getting close to GPT-4 performance. And last week there was a leak of the weights of that model somewhere. So that's pretty interesting. And Mistral acknowledged that leak and said, "We'll keep you posted." I think they'll just release it publicly soon. So I think we're getting closer to the GPT-4 level performance. I think that model, for example, is surpassing GPT 3.5 in ratings. So I'm pretty excited about that. And like we said on that episode, I find it very amusing that both of those open source models, BLOOM and Mistral, are French companies. So it seems that France is leading the European counter offensive on language models.
I think they're both built on Llama 2, if I'm not wrong.
Not BLOOM, not BLOOM, but
Right.
yeah, Mistral probably.
Okay.
I've got a tweet from the CEO of Mistral here. An over-enthusiastic employee of one of our early access customers leaked a quantized and watermarked version of an old model we trained and distributed quite openly. To quickly start working with a few selected customers, we retrained this model from Llama 2 the minute we got access to our entire cluster. The pre-training finished on the day of the Mistral 7 billion parameter release. We've made good progress since. Stay tuned. And then the Perplexity CEO has referenced this and said lots of people are asking if it's built on Llama, and yeah, there's an interesting conversation happening there. But yeah, that was just a week ago.
LLM politics. This is a whole new genre now.
I love it. One final thing before I think we wrap up. I wonder if you guys maybe if you try this while I'm talking about it, because I find it weird. One of you open up GPT, one of you open up Anthropic. But when I loaded up Anthropic and I said, because I've got a lot of love for Claude 2 with Anthropic, and I said, what languages can you translate? And it just tells me that it can't. None of these large language models are claiming that they can do translation, even though they obviously can. And none of the websites say what languages it performs well on. The only pieces of information are basically translation tools like Welocalize, or tools like BLOOM that were specifically designed around that. I think the use case is too expensive and too narrow for people to really have invested in pitching their model for this use case. It just has come out as one of these sort of emergent things. It's like, oh, that's kind of cool that it can do this. But the models themselves, like, you ask them about other things like the number of parameters, and they'll probably tell you because that's public information, but they don't tell you what languages they've been trained on, what languages they could output if you asked it to. You would have to just ask it to output in every single language to find out. Like, why do we have to gather that data ourselves? Why is that not public domain yet?
I asked ChatGPT with GPT-4 just now, and it very happily gave me a very long list of languages, and also said, and many others. If you need translation to or from a specific language, feel free to ask. So it's quite confident. But yeah, the list it gave me is quite extensive as well, including Urdu, for example, and Bengali.
Nice.
And I'm not completely sure if it's making this up or if it actually is proficient in those languages. Same as number of parameters. I doubt that if you ask it like how many parameters do you have, that I would trust the answer, right? It cannot introspect in that way. And it hadn't been trained by the time its training data was produced. So there's no information in the training data about how many parameters GPT-4 has, for example, right? So I would be very suspicious of any answer they gave me about that. But yeah, I do agree. There should be, in my research for this episode, I was really hoping to find some kind of list of officially supported languages myself, but I didn't find anything like this. Someone should make it.
Any closing thoughts, gentlemen, before we wrap up this episode, which I've thoroughly enjoyed? I think it was the hardest one for me to research. There just isn't that much out there.
My closing thoughts would be that we should support the languages of the world and not be Euro/Anglo-centric. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Unfortunately, it's quite a hard task because that support starts from data gathering, right? And that's a very manual and time-consuming process, but I fully agree.
Negroni Alex is laughing because you just shot me down. I just came up with a grand ethical statement. You were like, no, it's not going to work.
It's like you were going for, a Miss or Mr. Universe competition. You came up and you said world peace, and Alex just threw an egg at your face.
Yeah, that's literally
I think the scientific community fully agrees with Rafie, though, and I agree as well. Don't get me wrong. So there's a large push in scientific conferences for multilinguality. So whenever I've been to a conference in the last few years, it's a major theme. So people are starting to notice, and the scientific community is starting to work on those low resource language problems.
You have just given me a very cool thought. Maybe this will be my closing thought. You know how when you watch things like the United Nations and someone from, a representative of a country is standing up, speaking in their native language, and everyone's there sat at their country little podium with the little headphones on, which sometimes look like the one that Alex's robot is wearing in his background. And you've got the interpreters and the glass boxes all around listening and translating. Those jobs might go away to some extent because all they will need is the headphone, and it will be taking it in and it'll be translating it just on the fly.
It's the bubblefish from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? Looking forward to the bubblefish.
Yes, bubblefish. If anyone is looking for a hardware device to create, please create the bubblefish from Hitchhikers. That would make me so happy. I love that little thing.
I think you can use your phone for asynchronous translation, right? It's just the real-time translation. That's the challenge, I guess, which is just a matter of compute power, I guess.
Well, I think that because of the improvement to the chips that are in our smartphones and the improvement to the size of the models that can do effective translation, you can now run real-time on device, not connected translation. So I do think that bubblefish is very nearly here, and it's probably in all of our pockets already, and it's a phone. But thank you, gentlemen, for a lovely chat, and we'll see you guys next week. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Alex and Rafie. Negroni, Alex, and what's your drink, Rafie?
Yeah, and yours, Alex.
Maybe not mine is a Mai Tai.
Mai Tai, Alex, Negroni, Alex, and
by the way, for the records, Alex P is a cocktail expert, so there's a lot of thought behind that Mai Tai. If we're going with cocktails, I'll go for an old-fashioned because I'm pretty old-fashioned.
So the old-fashioned Rafie, yeah, that's pretty good. Today we're joined by old-fashioned Rafie and Negroni Alex for another episode of the podcast.
Yes.
Excellent. All right, next week's intro will definitely do that. Oh, except Alex, aren't you traveling to Taiwan? So we may not have you on the next one.
I am. I might be away for the next couple of episodes.
Don't suppose you want to do? Should we try and get you access to Taiwan Semiconductors Manufacturing Company? Just get you in there. Yeah, we tell them that you're on a podcast.
Alex, that's why I'm going there. But
the Mai Tai was a cover.
Mai Tai's a cover. It's really a secret chip thief. I probably shouldn't even joke about that because you won't get let in. Anyway, on that note, thank you everyone for listening, and